Welcome, everybody. As Michelle said, my name is Bruce Lynn. I'm the director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum up at Whitefish Point. I'm accustomed to doing programs in front of audiences that are right in front of me in a big room. So a lot of times I think in terms of asking people questions as I do the program, but I'm not going to do that as much here today. You might see me fall back into that every once in a while, but what I may do is occasionally put out a question and then answer it myself. But often I ask how many people have ever been up to Whitefish Point in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, and usually, depending on where I'm doing the program, I'll get about half or maybe a little more than that of the hands that would go up. But to start right into the program, and really this program talks a lot about what we do as far as telling the history of the shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and particularly Lake Superior, but also maybe a lesser known part of what we do with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society being an ongoing search for shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and again, primarily Lake Superior for us. This is Whitefish Point. I would imagine a lot of you have been up there before, and you've seen the lighthouse. I'm up at Whitefish Point right now. Michelle and I talked a little bit earlier today, and I think my connection might have been a little bit slow. Well, we kind of feel like we're at the end of the world up here. Maybe that has something to do with it. But hopefully this works out as far as when I click through the slides and how well you can all hear me as we're doing this program. But this photograph, an image by Chris Winters, shows the Whitefish Point Lighthouse, and that's our second tower up there. That lighthouse was built in 1861, and you can see a ship passing in the distance coming out of Whitefish Bay. That ship is headed upbound, and it's headed up into Lake Superior, and it could be going to any number of ports. And typically, this kind of ship traffic carrying iron ore. There's other cargoes they carry as well, but that's the main cargo. And really, historically, that's one of the primary cargoes that the lighthouses, and I say the lighthouses plural. Like I said, this is our second one. The first lighthouse was built in the late 1840s, more of a stone tower, more what most of us would think of a lighthouse. Our iron pile tower that you see right there, a lot of people think of that as more of a more modern design, but again, the United States or the American Civil War was just starting when this tower was being built, and it's still an operating lighthouse today. The Shipwreck Museum itself, we are open this year, even in the pandemic. We are open. We opened a little bit late in the season this year, but like a lot of museums up here in the Upper Peninsula and tourism spots, we've been really busy. It's been a very busy summer, and we are going to be open through October at this point. And like so many of the shipwreck stories that we like to talk about, and here's a nice map, historic map you can see of Lake Superior. If you can see my cursor there, I'm pointing out Whitefish Point right there. So the reason we had a lighthouse there in the first place was all of your ship traffic coming in and out of Lake Superior would have to go right around Whitefish Point. So it's a very strategic location to let these ships know that either they're getting up into the big lake and making the turn, or for the ships that are headed downbound and they're coming in out of Lake Superior, that they are going to be getting into Whitefish Bay, right in this area. The Sulaks are right in this area, and for any of you who visited Mackinac Island, it's down here in the Straits of Mackinac. So this gives you kind of a nice image of where Whitefish Point is located. It is an area where there are many, many shipwrecks. Some sources that I've looked at indicate that there could be 200 shipwrecks right in the area from Whitefish Point going west to the area of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. 200 shipwrecks. Some sources I've seen indicate 300 shipwrecks, but the bottom line is along this stretch of shoreline, we can say there's a few hundred shipwrecks. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The weather, obviously, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The weather being a big factor, of course, especially in the fall. November, not a great time of year to be out on Lake Superior. The weather's a big issue. If you look along that stretch of shoreline, what you're not going to see are harbors. Grand Marais has a small one. But for ship traffic today, Grand Marais is not going to help them much. But there wasn't much in the way of natural harbors along that shoreline. So when the ships did get into trouble, or if they were out in weather that was getting maybe a little bit more than they could handle, they often didn't have any place to run. We have a lot of fog that we get around Whitefish Point too. Throw in snowstorms, forest fires during different times in the late 1900s or I'm sorry, late 1800s, you could have reduced visibility, and that would cause problems for some of that early ship traffic. And we can never discount the problems of human error, misjudging of signals, maybe going too fast in the fog, things like that. For those of you who have visited the museum, you've seen a lot of the shipwrecks that are represented in our main museum gallery. Collision was a big factor, and we talk about those stories. So my point in showing this slide is you can see where Whitefish Point is. You can see this area that we call the Shipwreck Coast, Whitefish Bay right here, and we're going to talk more about these areas as we go along. Now, commercial ship traffic along this stretch of shoreline, very, very desolate stretch of shoreline today, much less back in the 1600s or 1700s. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have commercial shipping, but it looked a little bit more like what you see here. If we think of the fur trade, and for any of you who have visited the Straits of Mackinac, visited places like Colonial Michilimackinac, part of the Mackinac State Historic Parks, they talk a lot about the fur trade, and that fur trade was up in Lake Superior as well. So this was your first commercial ship traffic. So if the weather went south on a Montreal canoe, well, your voyageurs, they could bring that canoe up onto the shoreline, and you might have a scene that looked something like this. But as we got into the age of sail, and what we call tall ships today, schooners, barkentines, vessels like that, they didn't have that luxury. So if they were out in the weather, they got into trouble, often they had no place to go. And along that stretch of shoreline, as I talked about, there wasn't a lot of places for them to hide. We have a lot of shipwrecks we talk about at the Shipwreck Museum. One of them that you see right here, it's a vessel called the Invincible. It sailed. It was more of a commercial vessel, not a ship of war or anything like that. But it sailed right through the War of 1812 without a scratch. But shortly after the War of 1812 wrapped up, it was 1816. This vessel was on presumably the last trip of the season, late November 1816. It didn't even get out of Whitefish Bay. And this artwork that you can see right here gives us an idea of what might have looked like for the final moments of the Invincible. I think maybe there's a lesson in there too. We probably don't want to call our ship Invincible, but it didn't even get into Lake Superior. This vessel was headed west. It was headed out to the area of what we call Thunder Bay today in Ontario, Fort William back then, to put down an uprising that was taking place. And I think a lot of the crew on board the ship knew there were British soldiers on board. They knew it probably wasn't a great idea to cross the lake. But for any of us who've spent time up here, Mother Nature and Lake Superior can be very unpredictable. There's an outside chance they could have gotten across the lake without getting into trouble, but they didn't even get into the lake. So coming up from Sault Ste. Marie and just south of Whitefish Point, the Invincible came to grief, as we would say, and we're still looking for this vessel today. There's an early map by a cartographer by the name of Bayfield that shows the location of the Invincible, but we believe it's buried in sand at this point. We've used ground penetrating radar as a different way on top of the ice to try to find it, but we still haven't found it yet. We haven't found that smoking gun, so to speak, to tell us that some of the wreckage we found might actually be the Invincible. And the Invincible is a vessel that most people haven't heard of. This would be if we were all in a room together, I would ask, what's the one shipwreck that most of us think about on the Great Lakes period? And 90% of the group can answer that question. It is the Edmund Fitzgerald. So if the Invincible was the first, what we would consider commercial shipwreck in the area of Whitefish Point, in this area that is now called the Shipwreck Coast, or at least we call it that, well, the last would have been the Edmund Fitzgerald. And Gordon Lightfoot obviously did a lot to help public awareness of this shipwreck. It was November 10th, 1975, not that long ago. Gordon Lightfoot's song came out a year later, and it was #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. So a lot of people became familiar with that story, but in a lot of cases, people didn't realize it was based, in fact, on a ship that did sink 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. And they were trying to get into Whitefish Bay. A lot of people theorize, and rightly so, that had the Fitzgerald made that extra 17 miles and gotten into Whitefish Bay, chances are we wouldn't be talking about this as a shipwreck at this point. So this is the shipwreck that really arguably most people coming to the Shipwreck Museum would like to learn about and know about. But there are depending on the source that you use, there could be upwards of 6,000 or maybe even 10,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Different sources might give different numbers. But the bottom line is there are a tremendous number of shipwrecks, many of which are yet to be discovered. And so we're out searching for them, and there's a lot of other people that are out there searching for shipwrecks today, and then a lot of them are being discovered every year. It's pretty exciting. Anytime you know, open up the newspaper or turn on the TV and you're hearing about another shipwreck, whether it's us at the Shipwreck Museum discovering it, that's exciting for us, but I just think it's exciting in general that there's still a lot of these wrecks that are being searched for and being discovered here today. It really helps us to better understand, you know, shipping in these earlier eras. Now, speaking of earlier eras, then let's come back to Lake Superior and talk a little bit about early commercial ship traffic on the big lake, Lake Superior. This artwork you can see, this is an artist's conception showing an early steamship, and the first really arguably on Lake Superior, the Independence. That vessel was actually portaged. If for those of you who have visited the Sulaks, if you travel on Portage Avenue, right there by the Sulaks, well, that same roadway would have been used to portage. If you think of portaging a canoe, only think a little differently and think of portaging a ship from the Lake Huron level going up into the Lake Superior level around those rapids. And this is the Independence. This ship is one that's represented, and we have a good part of it inside of the museum gallery of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. So we like to talk about this one a little bit. And it's a different kind of shipwreck, but that image kind of gives you a view of what it would have looked like. It probably would have taken about 7 weeks to get it from the lower lake level up to the Lake Superior level, and then it would have been at that point in Lake Superior, period. The Independence did become a shipwreck. As I mentioned, there's sections of the hull, part of the keel, inside the main gallery of the Shipwreck Museum, but it wasn't a weather-related sinking. It didn't get overwhelmed by a storm. It was the last trip of the season for the Independence as well in 1853, and it was making its way out west. Typically, this would take supplies out to some of the settlements in Lake Superior, some of the mining areas. It would have brought iron ore back. But late 1853, and again in November, it was leaving Sault Ste. Marie, and a boiler explosion sent this ship to the bottom. So it wasn't Mother Nature necessarily that sank that ship, but it is represented in the museum gallery today, and it's another type of shipwreck. That was 1853 that the Independence blew up and sank. But we look at this slide, and 2 years later, there wouldn't have been any need to really portage the Independence. This was the opening of the Sulaks. So think in terms of 1855, now the Sulaks are open, and ship traffic, much more ship traffic was able to come up into Lake Superior. And if you take a look at this image, we'll look at the next one. Scenes like this wouldn't have been uncommon. It would have been a parade of ship traffic. I've got some historic images that were taken off of Whitefish Point, and you can see schooners, you can see steamers, you can see steamers pulling schooner barges, and that's going to be part of a story we're going to tell here today with the Nelson, the shipwreck we're going to talk about more in detail. But if you had scenes like this and you had that much more ship traffic coming up into Lake Superior, there was something else you had as well. And again, if I had all of you in front of me in a room, I would ask the question, so if you have more ship traffic, what else are you going to have? And somebody would get it. The answer is more shipwrecks. This is not on Lake Superior. I believe this image was on Lake Michigan. But after major storms, and typically in the fall of the year, after a massive storm pushing through, it wouldn't be unusual along the shipwreck coast and really any of the coastline of Lake Superior, particularly that southeastern part of the lake, to have vessels that would have been driven ashore. You know, sometimes the crew would be fine, other times they wouldn't be fine in situations, but this gives you an example of what it might have looked like after a big storm out on Lake Superior, or really any of the lakes for that matter. So with more ship traffic, you have more shipwrecks. Now let's step away for a moment, and the subject of the program today is a ship called the Nelson, and it was built in Milwaukee at the Ellsworth and Davidson shipyard. You can see a picture of that right there. Here's another view of that same shipyard. There were shipyards all over the Great Lakes. It's not like it is today. There aren't many ships being built on the Great Lakes these days, but back in the 1860s, the 1890s, there were ships being built all over the Great Lakes. And what you can't see in this image, or what you can't get a feel for, is the hum of activity that would have been taking place at these shipyards. You can see a steamship in the background there. You can see a schooner being built in the foreground, not completed yet. And the Nelson that we will talk about today was built there in Milwaukee. When it was first constructed, it was considered one of the most beautiful sailing vessels on the Great Lakes. And if you read this, it says the handsomest model of a bark ever built in Milwaukee. So a bark, in this case, meaning a barkentine, like a schooner, but square rigged on the foremast. So a little bit of a different type of sailing vessel there, but considered to be very, very beautiful. And many of the vessels being built in that era, 1860s, 70s, 80s, there was a grace about these ships that maybe we don't see as much today with a lot of the modern ships. Think of the 1,000 footers you'll see traveling out there, going through the Sulaks, passing close by to places where boat nerds like me like to watch ships go. They're very interesting to look at, but I don't know that many people look at a 1,000 footer, this is my opinion anyways, and say, wow, that's a really beautiful ship. What a graceful vessel going by. I don't hear that as much, but I think people are impressed by the dramatic size of those ships. But back in the 1860s, the Nelson, at least this individual, thought it was one of the prettiest ships they saw coming out of Milwaukee. And that's an artist's conception you can see right there. It was originally built as a barkentine, but like so many of these barks and schooners that were operating, by the time we got into the late 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, a lot of these were being used for a different purpose. And what was happening is their masts were being cut down, and they were actually being turned into barges. So there would be a reference to schooner barges. There were some purpose-built schooner barges, but in a lot of cases, they were what might have been beautiful vessels at one time that were now being turned into something a little bit more utilitarian, where they would be towed by a steamship. This is a photograph that was taken in August of 1890. That's the Nelson that you're seeing right here. If you can see that cursor of mine, that is a great photograph. It's one of the best of the Nelson. And then another, and these are often referred to as consorts, where a steamer, you can see a steamer right there. Here's another schooner barge. This is one called the Mary B. Mitchell. And the vessel you could just barely see right up there is called the A. Folsom. And the Folsom was the steamer that would have had a big heavy rope or a tow line that would have been towing both the Mary B. Mitchell right here and the Nelson. They were a pretty regular sight off of Whitefish Point and going through the Sioux Locks. And so that gives you an image of how that once beautiful vessel might have turned into something or looked a little bit different. Let's talk about the Nelson. And the Nelson at this time in the 1890s was part of the, or late 1890s anyways, part of the Mitchell Transportation Company. But let's just take a look at the history of this vessel in particular. I've got some bullet points here. It was originally going to be named the Wisconsin, but the owners decided to honor themselves and call it the Nelson. It was built as a barkentine, 163 feet long, 462 tons, and then in 1879, it was sold to the Menominee Barge Line Company, and the rig was changed. Sometimes if you do this research, often it's very clear what they're referencing. This may have been at that point where it was, and you see barge company. Those masts probably cut down at that point, and it would have been used as a schooner barge by 1879. 1880, though, it's sold again, and it is listed as a schooner again. And then by the mid-1880s, it ends up at the Mitchell Transportation Company. A couple of years later, now we see it listed as being lengthened, and it's 199 feet long. So that's kind of unusual too. Sometimes when you do this research, occasionally you'll have more questions being raised, but often it does explain a lot. And the Milwaukee Public Library has what's known as the Neff Scrapbook, which has all kinds of interesting information about the history of some of these vessels on the lakes. And here's a reference to the Nelson after it had been converted over to a barge. And if you read this quote, you can tell someone is being, I don't know, maybe they were waxing poetic, so to speak, being a little sentimental about maybe what the ship was. This individual indicates the barge Nelson was built in Milwaukee in 1866 above the Oneida Street Bridge. She carried a barkentine rig then and was considered one of the handsomest sailing vessels ever turned down on the Great Lakes. When converted into a barge, she was double-decked, and the change obliterated almost every trace of her early day beauty, although to the practiced eye, some traces of the fine lines were still discernible. So they didn't lose all of that beauty, but probably, arguably, most of it. So here you can see in the history of the ship, it went from being this graceful, lovely vessel, and then later more of a utilitarian barge. So kind of sad in a way. Now we think of ships like the Nelson and ships from that era. We have to take a look at the history of these vessels too. And I have to tell you, I didn't do all the research myself on this one. There's a gentleman by the name of C. Patrick Labadie. He's on the board of directors for the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. He's really a walking encyclopedia of Great Lakes maritime history. And a good part of the Alpena Public Library, there's a wing that has the vast majority, if not all, of his maritime collections. And he helped a lot with the research that we were doing here at the museum on this vessel. And much of what Pat Labadie helped us to locate made us think a little bit about this vessel. Now, when I say hoodoo ship, was it a bad luck ship is basically what I'm asking. But if you take a look at some more bullet points here of the history of the ship, we see 1866, we talked about that. It was enrolled and it was out there on the lakes and working. But later that same year, in October, had a collision with a canal boat in Buffalo. Then in 1875, the Nelson collided with the schooner Josephine off Port Washington. A year later, it had a collision with the steamer J.I. Case in Milwaukee. 1890, it was damaged in a collision with the steamer J.H. Devereaux at Lake George in the St. Mary's River. By 1892, it sank in a collision with the Susan E. Peck at Limekiln Crossing, Detroit River. It had a cargo of wheat, but it was raised. By 1895, 3 years later, it was aground at Powell Point, Munising, and in tow at that point of the steamer A. Folsom, which the Folsom is going to be a part of this story as well. They ended up getting it back to Marquette and got it repaired, and then by 1896, a year later, the barge Nelson, and you see it's referenced as a barge, lost steerage, drifted against a stone pier, and sank again in 20 feet of water. So you might think, wow, that ship had a lot of bad luck. But the more research you do, there were some ships that sailed through their whole career without too much in the way of trouble, but there were a lot of ships that were getting in trouble. So it wasn't really super unusual, but yeah, it makes you wonder a little bit about, was the Nelson a bad luck ship when you look at all of the collisions and problems it had in its career. Now, let's get to this part of the story of what happened. What happened when the Nelson sank? And this was May of 1899 that we're talking about. And the Nelson, and you can see it again in the foreground here, it's that same image that I showed you before. We're in Sault Ste. Marie. These are three vessels of the Mitchell Transportation Company out of Bay City, Michigan. So we have the Nelson that's right here. We've got the Mary B. Mitchell, and we've got the A. Folsom. They are upbound. They're headed to a place called Lake Linden. If any of you have been up in the Keweenaw Peninsula, it's a small town. You have to be driving to it to get to it, but there was a port there, and they were taking a load of coal. So the Mitchell Transportation Company, and so the Nelson, the Mary B. Mitchell, and the Folsom, they're all loaded up with coal, and it's winter is just receding at this point. The weather was considered to be quite nice on the 12th of May as they were heading upbound and headed up through Whitefish Bay. And just to take a closer look for a moment here, this is the A. Folsom. So it's a wooden steamer, and often these ships were called lumber hookers. Look at all the lumber stacked up on the deck of that vessel, and then if you look behind the crew there, at least the people that are helping to load it up, you can see stacks of lumber right there. These were workhorse ships. They weren't probably quite as graceful as what we thought of, or at least what those individuals that saw the Nelson sailing. They were definitely utilitarian workhorse ships, but they did have there was a little design to them as well. That's what would have been pulling the Mary B. Mitchell, which you can see in this picture right here. And you can even just barely make out Mary B. Mitchell right there. So it would have been towing the Mary B. Mitchell and, of course, the Nelson. And as they left the Soo Locks, the weather was considered to be quite nice, unseasonably warm. But after they turned around and gotten around the lighthouse at Whitefish Point, and that same lighthouse we see today, would have been the lighthouse they would have seen as well as they were getting up into the lake. But the weather started to get nasty. This is a 1940s image off of Whitefish Point, and you can see how nasty the weather is there. And there's our view of Lake Superior again. So here's Whitefish Point, and think of that that little trio of ships making their way up into the lake. The Folsom pulling the Mary B. Mitchell and the Nelson, and they would have gone right around Whitefish Point. They would have seen the Whitefish Point Lighthouse. You could just take a look at the bottom of this picture. I love to point out some of these things. You can see a woman wearing a lighthouse keeper's cap there, and a child, a baby with her there. That is a lighthouse keeper's wife. It's Charles Kimball's wife. His wife's name was Addie. They were there at Whitefish Point for 20 years straight, from 1883 to 1903, and this is their daughter Marguerite. They raised a whole family there, and they would have been working in that lighthouse when that little trio of ships made its way up into Lake Superior, made the turn around Whitefish Point, and started heading to the Keweenaw that you can see right here. It's possible that the captain of the Folsom, as he was pulling these other two vessels, thought a little bit about this, if they were to get into trouble, because the weather did start to worsen. The weather was getting kind of bad as they were passing a few life-saving stations. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the life-saving service, but you really had, well, let me step back. If you use a lighthouse as an example of a government effort to help steamships and sailing vessels navigate on the Great Lakes, think of a lighthouse helping in that way. You can think of the life-saving service being another government effort to help these ships, only their purpose was to help the ships if they got into trouble. This is a historic photograph of the Vermillion life-saving station. There were 4 of these stations that were built in 1876, and they were operational by 1877, going west. So if we left Whitefish Point, if I gathered the group of you and we started walking on the beach and going west about roughly 10 miles later, we would come to this station. And then a few miles beyond that, Chris Point, where there's a lighthouse today, but before the lighthouse, there would have been a life-saving station. And then there would have been Two Hearted River, yet another life-saving station, and then Deer Park would have been another station. They were the first 4 stations on Lake Superior, and there's only any remnants left of this building right here, of those 4 original stations. Vermillion is the only one that's left. As a matter of fact, there are some newer buildings up there that were built just prior to World War II, but this 1876 station house, this is the last one of those Lake Superior type stations for the life-saving service. There is actually, and this is kind of a sidebar, but there is a preservation group called SOS Vermillion. If you just Google SOS Vermillion life-saving station, you would find out more information about the preservation efforts for that remaining, the only one remaining of those 4 stations. So back to the story. Captain White on board the Folsom, the weather is starting to get worse, and he's having trouble maintaining headway. So picture, let's say you're in the pilot house there with Captain White, and the weather is getting worse and getting worse. You're having trouble keeping your steamer going, moving forward into those waves and towing those other 2 vessels. He might have thought a little bit about the life-saving stations that were along there. If they got into trouble, at least help might have been close at hand if anybody saw them getting into trouble. And this is what it might have looked like. Let's say you might have been in the pilot house and you're looking backwards. This is not the Mary B. Mitchell. It's not the Nelson. There's actually 4 schooner barges being towed by this steamer. I don't know the name of this steamer, but it might have been a view similar if you drop 2 of those vessels in the distance off, somewhat like the view that Captain White on board the Folsom would have had. But his weather was getting worse. He would have been keeping an eye on the weather. His crew would have been, they were working on board their vessel, but there were crews on board the Mary B. Mitchell and on board the Nelson as well. So he had to consider the safety of those crews on board those schooner barges that he was towing. The weather was getting worse and getting worse. It was usually in May up here. I think if any of you have been up here, it can be bitterly cold and that ice still floating out in the lake, depending on the severity of the winter. Well, Captain White on board that steamer that was towing the Mitchell and the Nelson, he made a reference to the weather. He was interviewed 2 days after about what happened by the Milwaukee Times. And he said, "It was a bitter gale we encountered. in relating the disaster. He went on to say the wind blew 50 miles an hour from the northwest, and it was freezing cold. The seas froze over everything when they broke aboard, and everything became covered with ice. Early yesterday afternoon, the wind and the sea became too severe to steam into any longer, and I determined to put the tow about and run back. I was watching the barges and saw the Mitchell make the turn successfully. The Nelson hung a little, and soon the space between her and the Mitchell widened, and it was certain the tow line had parted. Now, again, use your imagination and picture Captain White, probably with maybe a telescope, maybe a pair of binoculars, watching what's happening through the snow, through the wind, the waves crashing up over his vessel, and picture the bows just plowing into these big waves. What he was watching was the first of his two consorts making the turn, the Mary B. Mitchell. He was probably breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief because this was kind of a tricky maneuver to turn around in that kind of weather. It'd be tricky for his steamship by itself, much less with two other vessels that he's towing with a heavy line. So he saw the Mitchell make it okay. He might have breathed a little sigh of relief, but then when he saw the Nelson making the turn and he sees that distance, that gap growing, he knew at that point that they had broken that tow line. And so the Nelson at that point was on its own, and they have to worry a little bit about that. Captain White went on to say that the Nelson turned toward the shore, and I think her captain intended to beach her. I had supposed until then that she was in good shape, as they had made no signals before we were aware of her danger. She began sinking, and in a few minutes she dove for the bottom. The crew did not even have time to lower their yawl boat. Not a bit of wreckage was left to mark the spot, and the Nelson disappeared as quickly as one could snuff out a candle. That's pretty dramatic. He knew that crew. They had worked with him, the captain on board the Nelson, a man by the name of Hagany. They knew each other, and he just watched that ship disappear and just sink that quickly. You can only imagine what was going through his head as he watched that occur. But the conditions were such that he couldn't see what was happening in that short amount of time. The Nelson had gotten a little distance away from the Folsom and the Mary B. Mitchell. They had made that turn. I'm sure they slowed a little bit, but they couldn't slow too much because the waves would have overtaken them as well. If Captain White could have seen what was happening, and this is artwork by one of the best marine artists on the Great Lakes, Robert McGreevy. He did this in 2015. You can get an idea of what would have been happening with the crew and what was happening with the Nelson shortly before it sank. And there's a few things that I want you to pay attention to here. It might be hard for you to see, but I've got my cursor here, and you can see some davits here that they would lower that lifeboat or yawl, as Captain White referenced it. You can see they had tried, the crew of 5 or a crew of 8, depending on which source you look at, had tried to get those sails up. So they had a few minutes to react. They probably were not aware of how much water they had been taking on. You can see this dark thing right here. That's part of a boiler of a steam engine that would have been out there on the deck. And this after cabin right here, there's part of a ship's wheel. Probably very hard for you to see. But you can see people in this boat. This is a particularly tragic shipwreck in some ways. You know, most shipwrecks have a tragic element about them, especially where the loss of human life is concerned. But what's happening in this picture is Captain Hagany had lowered the lifeboat. His crew of, let's say, 5 on board, and his wife was the cook, and his infant child is on board that vessel as well. These waves are just beating the Sam Hill out of his vessel. He stayed on board the ship, and this next image you can see is another piece of artwork by McGreevy. You can see that they've got their lifeboat, or again, a yawl as it's referenced. Here's this after cabin. There's the ship's wheel, davits, tow bits that are right there. And here's Captain Hagany. He's climbing over the stern of the vessel. He's going to have to end up jumping into that bitterly, bitterly cold water. And what ended up happening here, and this is where this gets to be a really, really bad story, is that Captain Hagany did end up jumping into the water. Their lifeboat had a line attached to it, because if they hadn't, with the wind and the waves, Captain Hagany probably never would have been able to get into that lifeboat. But the problem here was that when Captain Hagany surfaced and had a couple seconds to catch his breath in that icy water, He looked up and he saw the stern of the Nelson rising up into the air, right practically above him, with a line still attached to the lifeboat. He watched that stern rise up and the ship just dove for the bottom at that point. And here's the terrible part of the story is that lifeboat that had his crew on board and had his wife and had his child, his infant child on board. That ship dove for the bottom in about roughly 200 feet of water, and it took that lifeboat with it. And Captain Haggerty, sadly, part of the story, did not ever see his family or his crew ever again. At this point, he's fighting for his own life. Doubtful that he's thinking about the life-saving service crew nearby at the Deer Park station. That's just not too far away from Grand Marais. On the, I say this side, I'm at Whitefish Point, so the east side of Grand Marais. But he probably wasn't thinking about that. As the Nelson dove for the bottom, that after cabin and pieces of wreckage started floating to the surface. And Captain Haggerty, luckily, fortunately, was able to grab a hold of a piece of wreckage. He ended up floating and the waves tossing him and that wreckage over and over, but ended up eventually getting onto the shoreline and started walking. And he had a good feel, he must have, had a good idea where he was located, and made that hike, walking across the windswept shoreline and the waves crashing on the shoreline, and sand blowing in his face and rain and snow. He eventually made his way to the Deer Park station. This is an image of the Deer Park station in 1911. I love this historic photograph. And incidentally, if any of you have ever gone camping in Muskellonge Lake State Park, you're not too far away from where this station would have been. As a matter of fact, they have historic markers and labels and such interpretive panels telling the story of this life-saving station. You can see the lookout tower. You can see the crew there with their surf boat. There's that station house, much like the one that would have been in Vermillion. There would have been a crew up there watching on that May day in 1899. There also would have been crew members out walking the beach, doing a beach patrol. They sometimes would walk as far, and maybe even longer, as much as 2 miles in one direction. And those life-saving service crew members would have been keeping an eye on the water, on the lake, watching out for any ships in distress, but this did not mean that they always saw one. And the Nelson was just far enough offshore that when it sank, that life-saving service crewman, or surfmen as they called them, or even storm warriors, they called them that as well, those members of the life-saving service, he didn't see it. So the way they knew that the Nelson had gone to the bottom was Captain Haggerty finally struggling and making his way to the Deer Park station. Some of the crew found him, and they got him inside the building and got him warmed up, and he was able to tell his story. Now, interesting part of the life-saving service, it was a government service. It's a predecessor to the United States Coast Guard, and there were annual reports to Congress. The 1899 annual report of the life-saving service to Congress, actually, and we're lucky here at the Shipwreck Society, we do have every single report that was ever put forward by the life-saving service. So I was able to do a little research there to see if there were any references to the sinking of the Nelson. And there was. It was fantastic that you could find that. And the keeper of the Muskellonge Lake or Deer Park life-saving station, it goes by either name, he, in his report about this shipwreck, he indicated schooner Nelson foundered in a fierce northwest gale some 18 miles west-northwest of the station at about 2:30 p.m. And all hands were drowned with the exception of the master, who was washed ashore on a piece of the schooner's cabin to which he had managed to cling. Those drowned consisted of a crew of 7 men and an infant son of the master. The first intimation the life-saving crew had of the disaster was the arrival of Captain Haggerty at the station in an exhausted condition. The crew gave him stimulants and dry clothing and cared for him until he fully recovered. The vessel was a total loss. Now, you notice in their Keeper McGaw references 7 crew members. Some newspapers I've read indicate 5. I've seen some that have indicated 6. The other thing I've noticed that when you do this research, there are inconsistencies. There was a reference to Captain Haggerty's infant son. In this, there's no reference to his wife, but the newspapers all made references to Captain Haggerty's wife being lost, but there's also references to his infant daughter. So there is some confusion there, but his wife and child, either way you look at it, were on board and unfortunately perished when the ship sank. Now, there was also a letter of acknowledgement. I saw this after I read Keeper McGaw's his summation of what happened that day. But by May 17th, just a few days later, Captain Hagenny sent a letter to the life-saving service, in essence, expressing his thanks, his gratitude for what had happened and how the life-saving service helped him that day. And he wrote, "Dear Sir, I wish to tender my thanks to Captain James McGaw, keeper of the Muskellonge Lake Station, for his kindness and prompt assistance while I was at the station. He and his wife and crew did all in their power for my recovery, as I was almost exhausted when I reached the station. They gave me stimulants and clothing and put me to bed, and they were very prompt in patrolling the beach for any bodies that might come ashore. I can hardly express my thanks to them for what they've done for me. Offering this, it will be considered. I'm yours respectfully, Andrew Hagenny, Schooner Nelson." I've got there's a little pop-up on my screen that I can't hide at this point, so it blocks the last part of that, but you get the idea, and you can see that on your screen that the life-saving service in this particular instance had a little bit more passive of a rescue role, but at the same time, had the station not been there, as was the case prior to the 1876, there's a very good chance Captain Hagenny would not have survived that shipwreck himself. Interesting part of the story, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our discovery of the schooner Nelson. But after we found this shipwreck, we publicized the fact, and it was interesting. There was a lot of media attention. I was surprised myself by the number of media outlets that reached out to us here at the Shipwreck Museum asking questions about the shipwreck. Huffington Post, as an example, contacted us. There was a media outlet in London, in England, that contacted us, and a number of other media outlets throughout the country were contacting us and asking questions about the shipwreck. I was surprised by that, and I was also surprised by the contact we had with family members, descendants of the crew in one case, the first mate of the Nelson, his great niece, might be three greats in there, I forget, but she contacted us and indicated to us that this was a story that had been shared in her family, that they had had an ancestor that went down on a ship on Lake Superior in the late 1890s. And the other, probably the most interesting call that I had, at least in my position here as the director of the museum, was that I had a call from the great-granddaughter of Captain Hagenny. And he was the only survivor from the shipwreck. His wife and his child did perish when the Nelson sank, but he survived this shipwreck himself, and he moved to the southwest of the United States. This great-great-granddaughter of his did tell us that the story, as it was presented in the media that she had read, was very, very similar to the story that her family had handed down generation by generation of an ancestor that had been on a ship that sank in Lake Superior, and then he moved to the southwest of the United States at that point. Apparently, Andrew Hagenny wanted to really get away from the Great Lakes at that point, and probably understandably so. And he started a new family. And so people were contacting us that had a connection with this particular shipwreck, and honestly, I found that to be fascinating. There was another article that was about Captain Hagenny himself and what ended up happening to him within a couple weeks after the sinking. And this is out of the newspaper article out of the Door County Advocate, May 27th, 1899. This article indicated, quote, "The terrors of a shipwreck, exposure on a bit of wreckage in the icy waters of Lake Superior and a gale of wind, and on the beach, and grief over the loss of wife and child and crew have brought Captain Andrew Hagenny of the schooner Nelson to such a physical and mental condition that he is now confined at the Marine Hospital at Toledo. The doctors class his trouble as nervousness and insomnia." Probably not hard to understand for everything that he had gone through at that point, and probably led to his decision to leave the Midwest of the United States in the area of the Great Lakes and move to a different location and start a new life. Now, we're going to shift gears here completely, and we're going to move forward. We're leaving 1899. We're moving to 2014. and we have a research vessel. This is something that most people do not see as they visit the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. We do talk about it, but I think a lot of people still are unaware. We have a vessel. It's called the David Boyd. It's a former U.S. Army Corps of Engineers research vessel that we use to actually search for shipwrecks. We do it as much as we can. That doesn't mean we're finding shipwrecks every year, but we're out there and we're still trying. We're able to get a crew and get out there and be on the lake and look for these shipwrecks. Mother Nature has a lot to say about this, and technology doesn't work always exactly as you'd like, but we do use a certain amount of technology as we look for these wrecks. A lot of times when we do talk about this at the museum, people will ask us, well, how does that work? How do you know where a shipwreck might be, or do you accidentally find them? Well, that gives us the opportunity to talk a little bit about that technology we use, but we can also say that, yeah, at times we do accidentally find these ships. We might be out looking for a certain vessel and accidentally come across another. And how we do that would be with our crew that we have that goes out on the vessel. This is kind of an interesting image because you can see three people here. If you look in the reflection, there's a gentleman by the name of Terry Banash. He's our former site manager and a longtime president of the Shipwreck Society. The gentleman at the wheel that you can see right here his name is Eric Foreman. Tragically, he passed away in a diving accident a few years ago. But this gentleman you see here is our director of marine operations at the Shipwreck Museum. His name is Daryl Ertel. He's been out looking for wrecks for a long time on the Great Lakes, and he's a part of our team, a big part, actually, really arguably leading that effort to find shipwrecks for the Shipwreck Society. So we have a crew, and we pull what we call a towfish. And really what we're using here is sonar to take a look at the bottom of the lake to see what we might be able to find. We have a somewhat older system that we use, and a company by the name of Marine Sonics built this. We have a newer system, and we're just kind of having a few teething problems with that at this point, but we're getting it sorted out. But this image can show you the towfish. It almost looks like a torpedo at that point, and it's scanning using sound waves at the bottom of the lake. And at the bottom of this image, you can see this is what would be called a water column. But on either side of that is what we see on the bottom of the lake. It says a boulder, it says gravel, and where you see the boulder here in the image. And often you would see a shadow created by that. And when we found the Nelson, and a little bit of luck worked its way into this, it looked something like this. This is not a great sonar image, but you can see a little bit of a shadow, and you can see there's something there on the bottom of the lake. So our crew did a turnaround and came back and took a look again, used a little bit of a different frequency, and suddenly we saw something that looked like this. Look at that shadow. At that point now, you can imagine there's a great deal of excitement inside the pile house. We knew the Nelson could be in this area. It is a shipwreck that we had talked about, and so we were out there scanning the bottom of the lake looking for a number of different ships at that point, but we were fortunate enough to find the Nelson at that stage. And it looked like that on the bottom in that sonar image. So now let's go take, and we have what's called an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle. It's like I think if I could use an analogy, think of a little robot that has controls. We can control it underneath the lake. It's got high-powered lighting, intense lighting, and cameras, high-definition cameras that we can go down and take a look at what might be there. We will use this at times to if the sonar image doesn't tell us exactly what we're looking for, to try to get a better look through cameras at what might be on the bottom of the lake. And when we put that Phantom S4 ROV, kind of an aging unit, big heavy unit that we have, we put it down the lake, and some of the first images, well, these are some of the better images that I'm going to be showing you, but some of the first images let us know that suddenly we had really found something here, but we needed to be able to identify what it was. You know, there might have been thoughts in the back of some of our minds that it could have been the Nelson, but we really weren't sure. But if you remember the artwork by Robert McGreevy that I showed you, and I pointed out the tow bits, look at these big, heavy pieces right here. I mentioned to you that the Nelson was being used as a schooner barge, and it was being towed by a heavy line, a heavy rope. This is part of the ship's wheel right here. So this is at the stern of the vessel. This is what's called a capstan. And this would have been used for pulling an anchor up. It could have been used for raising a sail. It would have used manpower in essence. And I can show you kind of a funny image here in a minute. It would show you how that might have worked. But this is the stern of the vessel. This is the gunwale back here. So look at how clear of a shot we're getting here. And this is truly, truly exciting. I am not a scuba diver. So for me, I'm more of a museum background guy. So for me, the first time I was able to look at scenes like this through the eyes, so to speak, of our ROV, those cameras, I was pretty excited. This was so cool to be able to see this. Here's another view of the ship's wheel. You can see it's been crumpled a little bit as that ship sank and went down to the bottom over 200 feet of water. And here are those tow bits. Again, there's another view of the capstan. This is part of a mast that you can see right there. Here's a different view. This is, again, looking at the stern. And again, there's the gunnel, capstan right there, part of the mast. This big gaping hole you can see is where that cabin would have been. So that cabin, that air pressure building up, burst that cabin off of the deck of the ship. And this might have been part of the wreckage that Captain Hackney got a hold of. And there's another view looking at those tow bits you can see right there. Here's a close-up view, part of a mast. This is part of the gunnel right there. So if you would have been walking on the deck, you could have looked out over that gunnel and looked out over the water. And part of what appears to be a stove right there on the deck of the ship. Here's another view. And here's the cool thing about this. There's a couple things that I'd like to point out in this picture. One, you can see part of the original paint. You can see red paint on the deck of that ship. This ship sank in 1899. This was 2014 when we found this schooner that had gone to the bottom, this schooner barge. You can see that red color. What you're not seeing also are zebra mussels. They're not covering that ship like, as an example, if this vessel had gone down in Lake Huron or if it had gone down in Lake Michigan. Think of some of those ships if you've visited the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. Fascinating shipwrecks that they have there that you can see on their website, some imagery, but often they are, not often, all of them are just covered over with zebra mussels, where here they're not. So you can see that original paint. You can see a big spoon right there. Possibly Captain Hackney's wife would have used that as she was the ship's cook. You can see a big hunk of coal, part of a crock, some daily items and part of the cargo right there resting on the deck of that ship. Now, the Nelson was interesting. It had 3 capstans. This is the center capstan. You're seeing the deck right there. That probably would have been used for raising sail. Now, step away for a moment. We see that capstan right there. I said there was a funny image that I would show to show how that used. Really, those capstans would be pushed. They had capstan bars. Look at these Sea Scouts. This kid kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. He must be barking out commands to them. But using youth power in this picture, human power basically, they're turning this capstan, and that it would either be raising a sail or raising up an anchor in lieu of a steam engine or another form of an engine or motor power to raise that. So those kids are turning a capstan, and that's a capstan bar you can see right there. If you take a look at this image here, you can see another part of a mast, another part of a crock, some more coal. But there are some capstan bars that are there as well that are along the gunnel. So it shows parts of that ship are still intact. They are where those bars were put by the crew the last time they had used them. Here you can see some pictures of dead eyes. The rigging of the ship would have gone through there. There's a block, another tow bit right there. The fact that these are intact, they're in place, and you can see them so clearly, it speaks to how well preserved this ship is in the bottom of Lake Superior. Here you can see some coal down in the hold of the ship. That coal again was being taken to Lake Linden up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. Obviously, that cargo on board the Nelson never made it to Lake Linden. It still sits on the bottom of Lake Superior. Here's part of a cat head and part of the anchor. The cat head, that anchor would have helped and would have supported that anchor prior to newer type of anchors that wouldn't have used this. And often, if you look at tall ships, if you're fortunate enough to visit one, those cat heads, if they have them, often will have carvings on the end of them. Think of a figurehead near the stem of a vessel. Similar kind of an idea, at least as far as the artwork, if you want to call it that. Now, this was exciting too. I wasn't on board the David Boyd the day that the ROV was down there, and they were able to take a closer look at the ship we put our ROV down on the Nelson a number of times. And again, if you have, sometimes you're not exactly sure. Sometimes there's no question what vessel you're looking at, but in this case, we needed this to be able to tell us exactly what we were looking at. And it doesn't get any better than this either. To see the name, the name Nelson up near the bow of the ship at that point. So we suddenly knew exactly what ship we had found, and this was a pretty exciting moment for everybody as well. Here's another view, interesting. Looking at these dead eyes again, still intact. There's what's called a chain plate there that's going along the outside of the hull of the vessel, and another block there visibly just resting there. Those things haven't seen any activity really since 1899, prior to 2014, and we were able to put our ROV down on there and take a look. This, if I had you all in front of me in a room, I would ask the question, does anybody remember the name of the shipping company? Because you can see a big white M. That paint is still there. And it's funny, I've done this program a few times. It's been a little while, but often people will get it right. And someone in the crowd will point out it was the Mitchell Transportation Company out of Bay City. And that's what part of that M is there showing. You can see where part of the hull is broken there as it hit the bottom. Now, this is interesting. We're up at the bow. Those first few slides that I had shown you were at the stern, where you could see the ship's wheel, and you could see those massive tow bits. You could see the capstan there. Well, we're up near the stem right here, if you're able to see my cursor, and you can probably tell what this is. It's an axe. There is some question, and was some question, if you think of Captain White on board that steamship that was towing them that day. He looked back and saw that gap growing between the Mitchell and the Nelson, and then he said that he could see the distance growing, and he was sure that the line between the Mitchell, which obviously was the case, the line had separated from the Mary B. Mitchell and from the Nelson, so suddenly the Nelson was on its own. Well, there was some discussion amongst some of us here at the museum, and you have to wonder, they had an axe near the stem there if they needed to cut that line if they had to. But if you look at this, the axe is still in its place. So did someone pick that axe up and break that tow line and put the axe back? I don't think so. I think that line broke as the pressure was increasing as they tried to make that turn through the wind and the waves, and that axe is right there in its position all these years later. Here you can see another view from a little bit of a distance, and you can see the axe right there, and there's the stem right up there right at the bow of the Nelson. Last couple slides I'm going to show you that show inside the hold and some of the wreckage. We did have a few divers down on the Nelson, but much of what you're seeing here, at least a lot of it, is from a good part of the imagery is coming from our ROV, and you can see coal down there inside the hole. You can see part of a wood-burning stove right there. So some of those little bits of everyday life that can be seen in the wreckage of this ship. There is, and these are kind of haunting pictures, I think. That's another capstan you can see on the deck right there. There's some cleats there. There's part of a line. Some really kind of haunting images you can see. This one's kind of a scary one. If you might have been one of those divers down there and getting closer, and this thing looms up out of the murk and out of the shadows. This is actually part of a boiler for a steam donkey engine that also would have been used to help with raising sails or raising things up onto the deck. There's another view of it. You can see right there, again, a boiler. And there's the engine itself. You can see some more of that coal right there littering the deck of the Nelson as it rests in that cold water and over 200 feet due west of Whitefish Point. There again, one of the last views I'm going to show you in the wreckage, you can see very clearly the name Nelson on the side of the ship. We clearly knew once we saw that which shipwreck we had. And at that point, we started thinking in terms of telling this story at the museum and telling it in the Shipwreck Journal, the publication that we put out by the Shipwreck Society, and maybe eventually an exhibit that we'll be able to put out telling that story. And that will be the story we'll tell for those of you and any of you, and hopefully all of you, come back to visit us at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. This is really my last slide that I'm going to show you. We do have a new exhibit gallery. It's part of an old U.S. Navy building that's at Whitefish Point that was there in the 1920s. For those of you who visited, it's our old theater building. That's an old U.S. Navy radio compass station building. That is going to become next year, and hopefully the pandemic will be behind us at that point. We should have opened it this year, but we didn't due to everything being backed up due to the pandemic. But with luck, and hopefully we'll be able to have that open. And eventually, in all likelihood, you will see an exhibit about the Nelson. So what ends up happening with these shipwrecks and that part of the Shipwreck Society that most of you wouldn't see, it's an active part of what we do. We find the shipwrecks, and it helps us to relate and tell these stories, much like what we're doing here today with this Zoom program. So I'd like to thank you all for being a part of this and joining me, and thank Michelle and the Soo Locks Visitor Center Association and the Corps of Engineers, the what I call the Canal Park Museum. Just thank you for all attending, and thank you, Michelle, for the invitation. And I think at this point, maybe, Michelle, I turn it over to you, and we can see what kinds of questions are out there.
Okay, we'll give everybody a few minutes to type in some questions that we'll give to Bruce. But for a few minutes, I want to review our status at our visitor centers in Duluth and at the Soo Locks. You can see the information up there on the screen. One change that we have had recently is the Duluth outdoor guest services are now from 9 to 5 p.m. And we continue to be 9 to 9 at the Soo Locks. And please, anyone, if you are visiting the Soo Locks and you have questions, feel free to go up to our attendant. They're freezing cold, and if you go and visit with them, it helps their day go a little quicker. You know, they're starting to compare themselves to mailmen as they stay to their post there in all weather. The scavenger hunt that we have at the Soo Locks is also available on our website. You can download it in advance of coming if you wish. And once again, our centers are closed to the public, and they will reopen when we can do that safely with local, state, and federal guidelines. Next week, or not next week, I'm sorry, we're doing programs twice a month. And our next program will be October 1st. And it looks like it's going to be a pretty fun, interactive challenge for all of us who are boat nerds and harbor nerds and Lake Superior experts, with Tom Holden, the former director of the Lake Superior Marine Museum. And with that, let's get some questions for Bruce. I'm going to start out with one that I had, because I'm running the program, so I can be first. Bruce, I'm familiar with how they lengthen a modern freighter. How do they lengthen a wooden boat?
You know, that's a very technical question, Michelle, that when we read that, I almost think it's a mistake. I'm sure it could be done, but I don't know of many references that I've read where they would lengthen those ships, but I'm sure they have their ways. I'm just not really familiar with how they would have done that. I don't know if I could give you a technical answer that would really help you to better understand how they would have done that. I guess I would throw it back to you. I know you've done a lot of research on these vessels. Have you seen a lot of ships from that era in that time period that would have been lengthened?
I'm not familiar. I mean, I work with a lot of engineers who would say that anything is possible with
Sure.
enough money and time, but I just wondered if you might have known that. So we'll get to the legitimate questions now.
You hit me right out of the gate with a hard one there. So.
Ron is asking, did the divers retrieve any artifacts from the Nelson?
So the question is, did the divers retrieve any artifacts? No, absolutely not. We at the Shipwreck Society, we want to get as many images as we can, but if we wanted to ever retrieve an artifact, we would have to have a pretty darn good reason for it. There is a shipwreck that's in Whitefish Bay that we've talked to the State of Michigan Underwater Salvage and Preserve Committee about, that we want to recover. We think there's possibly a chance that it could be something at risk. Someone might be able to go and grab it and take it away, and nobody will ever see it again. So our thought was, if we were able to recover it, maybe we could exhibit it at the museum. But to go along with that, we would need a conservation plan. We did get a permit to do it. but the conservation plan really is something that I'm not a conservator. We do not have a professional conservator on our staff, so we would need to hire that out. And Michelle would know it can be a pretty expensive process to do this. And so maybe eventually we'll go back to that. But to answer that question, no, we did not take any artifacts off of the Nelson.
And is the location of the wreck available to qualified tech divers?
I would say have them give me a call at the Shipwreck Museum. You can get our contact information. Our website is shipwreckmuseum.com. Again, my name is Bruce. Last name is Lynn. Give me a call. We can talk about it. So it's not something, we haven't released that location. I will say it's in the vicinity of Grand Marais, off in that area, but we haven't released that to the public yet. There are some divers that we have worked with in the past that have gone down and helped document it for us. So we would want to just talk to you first, kind of thing, before that would happen.
And Tom is asking, could you repeat the depth and general location of the Nelson? So you just hit the general location, and is it part of the local preserve?
It's not part, it's outside of the local preserve, but it's in a little over 200 feet. But yeah, it's in that area of Grand Marais.
Okay, and Ron is asking, does Lake Superior, by its size, have the most number of shipwrecks?
No. That's a hard question to answer, too, because depending on the source you look at, some sources will have different statistics as far as the number of shipwrecks, but no, I'm pretty sure Lake Superior does not have. Now, if the next question is which Great Lake has the most shipwrecks, I'm not remembering that off the top of my head at this point. But Lake Superior, I'm reasonably certain, does not have the most.
And Mr. D is suggesting that you measure the length of the Nelson on the bottom. Then you'll know for sure if she was lengthened.
That's true. It's kind of beat up a little bit, so as you can imagine. But we haven't gotten to that point of measuring yet, but that's a good idea.
And Bert is asking if any parts have washed ashore and been preserved.
Not Bert, not that I'm aware of. Is this Bert that I know that comes up and visits every so often? I think it probably is. I think I know Bert, but no, not that I'm aware of. That would be an interesting to do further research with the newspapers of the day, because often, especially up here in Sault Ste. Marie, if you go to your local library, the microfiche, Michelle, I'm sure you've done this before there at the Bayless Library in Sault Ste. Marie. You can go through they have marine sections that will talk about shipwrecks and talk about findings. And sometimes even a few weeks after a certain shipwreck, you can find references to that shipwreck because of that question Bert's asking, that maybe wreckage has come ashore, or maybe someone found a piece of the pilot house, in a different location of the lake. And that kind of thing. So, but no, not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of Nelson wreckage having come ashore, at least any references to it.
Now, based on Bert's question, if people are walking the beaches up there around Whitefish Point, do things wash ashore, or are there things to be found?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. It just depends on the severity of the winter. When I was a kid, we used to go up to Whitefish Point a lot. And we would find sections of a boiler. There'd be parts of a hull. You might find there was part of a bulkhead that we had found at one time. There could be, depending on the winter, there might be wreckage the following year that we have never seen before. That goes for shipwrecks in general. There are some wrecks that we know their position. They might be in 20 feet of water, like the Saturn or the Jupiter. The Saturn is it was another schooner barge that's about 3 miles, if I remember correctly, due west of Whitefish Point. And some years it's highly visible. It's only in maybe 15 feet of water or so. And then the next year it's gone. Where to go? But the sands get shifted around. And I think a lot of you have probably read newspaper articles that reference, with the lake levels having gone up so much, that has affected the shorelines. And now people are seeing shipwrecks. They're finding pieces of shipwreck. And what I would recommend, I know I'm on a tangent here, so forgive me, but we'll get calls a lot. Somebody will call from, the western end of, or eastern end of Lake Erie and say, hey, we found this piece of wood and we think it's from a shipwreck. And do you know what ship it's from? that's kind of a hard question for us to answer. I love the interest. I love the fact that people are reaching out to us and asking those kinds of questions. But I think what I'd recommend, if you ever do find something, do some research with your local historical society, if you have one. Do some research with the museums that are in your area, and often they will have, especially if these are port cities or communities that are near Great Lake and where a shipwreck may have occurred. Often those stories are preserved in those museums, and give them a call. You can always give us a call too. We love to talk to people about these things, but you might find more information more quickly by contacting that local historical society. But certainly, yeah, there are bits and pieces you'll find, and I wouldn't be surprised if more of you, especially if you have an interest in shipwrecks, you've probably found things yourselves. So I kind of got off the mark there, but
That's all right.
Hopefully helped answer it.
Ron had a question. Why were there no zebra mussels on the Nelson?
So we don't have them in Lake Superior at this point. There might be some maybe in a little bit of the western end of Lake Superior, but by and large, they're not in Lake Superior. There's a lot of different theories as to why they're not here. Maybe that frigid cold water. One of my favorite books that I had, really the one that got me interested in shipwrecks, I was probably in the 4th grade. I have an original copy of it here just to my left, which I'll pick up. It's Radigan's book, Great Lakes Shipwrecks and Survivals. This is an old copy right here. We still sell copies of it in the museum store, but he makes a reference to Lake Superior having 2 states, solid ice and melted ice. And maybe that frigid, bitter cold water might have something to do with it. That would be the theory that makes the most sense to me, why they're not there.
Okay, we got one about the lighthouse here. In the picture of the lighthouse on the screen, there is a pipe going from ground level to the catwalk. What's that for? It's smaller than the stairway enclosure.
I think I see Terry Wolski in the group here. I think Terry would probably love to answer that question. But this pipe you're seeing is, so let's step back and talk about lighthouses for a couple minutes, if everybody's willing to bear with me. There are a lot of lighthouses on the Great Lakes. If any of you have been to, say, Mackinac Island or Mackinac City, there are about a dozen or more, depending on how far you consider the Straits of Mackinac stretching out. There's a lot of a lot of lighthouses in that area. And with Whitefish Bay and Whitefish Point, there are lighthouses, a number of lighthouses up here too. So it's important that every lighthouse look a little bit different. It's one thing to see them in daytime, but any of us who visited a lighthouse at night, it's kind of cool to see that light shining out from the tower. Well, it was also important for every one of those lighthouses to look a little bit different at night. So in other words, each one had a different, what could be called a light signature or characteristic. And as that light would flash, let's say if the light flashed and then it eclipsed, or you saw darkness for 10 seconds and then it flashed again and then eclipsed for another 10 seconds, that would be the characteristic of that lighthouse. Now, how do these characteristics work? How did a lighthouse do that, especially if they didn't have electricity? We didn't get electricity at Whitefish Point until just before World War II. It was 1939 that we had commercial electricity coming up to the point. So how would they have had a lens? And gosh, we could really get off on a tangent. I could talk about Fresnel lenses, but it's a series of prisms that would surround a light source, and it would intensify and bend or refract light. But the base idea is it's a lens. It might look like a big beehive, only it's prisms, and it would intensify that light, and some of them would rotate. And they would create a flash. They would emit a flash, but it had to be able to rotate somehow. There wasn't an electric motor at Whitefish Point for this tower prior to, well, at least we know for a fact prior to 1939. But they would have needed a clockwork mechanism. A clockwork mechanism. Think of a grandfather clock. Think of a cuckoo clock. And you would crank weights up, and the weights would descend and slowly rotate that big Fresnel lens that would have been right up in here, right in that tower. So this is a different kind of lighthouse. It's not like, say, Chris Point, Iroquois Point, a lot of these other lights that could allow weights to go down through the tower. The way it worked at Whitefish Point is you had this big pipe, and the weights would have been inside that. Those weights would have descended, and as they descended, they would have rotated a lens up inside that lantern room of light. So there is a very long-winded response to that question about what that pipe is right there. How's
Well,
that?
Bruce, I think we'll have to have you back to talk about lighthouses in the future.
I'd be happy to.
And another question here from Julie. Are lots of individuals looking for shipwrecks as well as the museum? Her uncle used to do that and would make furniture from the wreckage.
Oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of them that are out that are actually being a lot more successful. I think we've been pretty successful over the last few years finding shipwrecks. I'm very happy with what we've done, but there are some other individuals that are out there now that are searching for shipwrecks and being really successful. As a matter of fact, some of you are probably aware of a shipwreck that was found down in Lake Michigan just here in the last few weeks. Michelle, are you familiar with which one that was?
No.
I had a half a dozen people send me messages when it was one of the car ferries, I believe, that used to cross Lake Michigan, and trying to think of the individuals that found this.
Tom is saying the Père Marquette 18.
There you go. Exactly. That is the one that was located, and there are, to answer that question without going too far off on another tangent, certainly we are not the only ones out there looking for shipwrecks. There's a number of groups that are out there, and I wish them all luck, because even if we don't find all these shipwrecks, I'd love to be able to connect with some of these other folks that are out there. Maybe we can tell if they find a shipwreck like that was just located, there's a great story. All of them have very interesting stories. And so, yeah, we're not the only ones, to be sure.
And we had a question from Ron. Were lifeboats equipped with an axe so that one of the crewmen could have cut the rope?
Yeah, I would think that they would have been. They would have had certain equipment that would have been on board. I think probably what happened, that all happened so quickly. The way Captain Hagney related that story, he jumped overboard, and as soon as he surfaced, that stern was rising up and going to the bottom. And chances are, as soon as that stern heaved up, they were all tumbling out of that lifeboat at that point, and probably wouldn't have had much of a chance to actually do anything about their situation. But yeah, I'm reasonably certain that there would have been, as part of the equipment that would have gone on a lifeboat, they probably would have had an axe. One would think, anyways.
And I'm presuming you didn't find traces of the lifeboat on the bottom?
I'm surprised no one asked that.
Well, I did.
That's the question a lot of people ask about, and no, we haven't found that yet. So that's hard to tell, but no, we've not found that yet. I would love to find it, but we have not yet.
Okay, and I'm going to tee you up for a softball question here. So you have a big, fairly solemn ceremony every year for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald in November, and I was wanting to ask you about what you're going to be doing this year.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad you asked that question. So every year we have a memorial service on November 10th to remember the ship and crew, the 29-man crew that went down on the Edmund Fitzgerald. It is easily the most popular event that we have each year. We have several hundred people that, I hate to use the word cram into the museum gallery, but that's kind of exactly how it ends up being. There's every single year, I've been in this job for 10 years now, every year there are, it is standing room only in the gallery. So we have to think about what's happening this year, right? It is our most popular event that we put on. It could be a blinding snowstorm, and we still have crowds coming up and people waiting all the way out to the parking lot trying to get inside the building. But this is different this year. It is a pandemic. The current executive order from the governor limits such social gatherings to a very small number of people. And so what we're going to do this year, we're not going to do this as a public event this year. It's going to be a virtual event. Now, with that being said, we are still doing this event this year. It is going to be for family members that are surviving family members from the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald. There's about a dozen people that I've talked to so far that in one case, her cousin was a crewman on board the Fitzgerald. In another case, her father was a cook on board the Fitzgerald. In another case, the other was a deck watch on board the Fitzgerald. So about a dozen family members that I'm talking to. Some of them will be bringing some family members with them. We'll have a speaker come in, but it will be a virtual event. And so you'll all be able to, kind of like you're doing here right now, you'll be able to tune in and watch that. We'll be getting information out on our website. That's shipwreckmuseum.com. And also TV 9 and 10. It's the CBS affiliate that's up here in northern Michigan. They are going to carry this live as well. So for those of you who live in northern Michigan, you'll be able to watch that if you are in the range of TV 9 and 10. But if you're not, I would say keep an eye on Facebook, keep an at least the Shipwreck Society's Facebook page, and keep an eye on our website. Again, shipwreckmuseum.com, and we'll be getting more information out and a link you'll be able to join in. This is the 45th anniversary of the sinking of the Fitzgerald. That doesn't seem possible to me because I can still remember references to it when I was a kid. But yeah, thank you, Michelle, for asking that question because that is important. It is going to be closed to the public and Fitzgerald family members essentially only.